Welcome to the debate. Valentine's Day is, well, it's unique, isn't it? It's one of those few cultural moments that is just so highly visible, globally recognized, and at the same time, intensely scrutinized. It drives huge consumer participation and generates some really strong emotional reactions, both good and bad.
And that polarization is exactly what's worth examining. I think we're asking a pretty fundamental question about what this holiday has become. Is Valentine's Day, primarily a genuine, spontaneous celebration of love? Or does its very structure, this highly commercialized, ritualized structure, inherently turn it into an act of obligatory social performance?
My position is that the structure of the holiday, and yes, that includes the commercial mechanisms we often criticize, isn't a corruption of the real thing. I actually see it as a necessary framework. It provides a culturally recognizable and frankly high-stakes way for people to enact valuable emotional expression and to send really clear signals of commitment.
See, I come at it from a different angle. While sure, romantic feeling might be the starting point, the mandated participation and the ever-escalating financial side of it, I think that framework prioritizes social obligation. It prioritizes the psychology of indebtedness, and that pressure, I would argue, inevitably diminishes the authenticity of it all, making the whole celebration feel less like a choice and more like a social test.
Well, to really understand its power, you have to look at its historical depth, the longevity of this thing. It speaks to a persistent cultural need. I mean, we're talking about a tradition you can trace back to medieval poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, Otto de Grandson back in the late 14th century. They're the ones who took a Christian feast day for martyrs and explicitly tied it to romantic love, to the mating of birds. It gave it this powerful new meaning, which, proves its resonance was initially cultural, not corporate.
That historical root is vital context, I agree, but what happened next is what really defines its modern state. That cultural feeling was very quickly industrialized, standardized.
But standardization is just the scalable technology of a ritual. I mean, look at someone like Esther Howland in the mid-19th century, the so-called mother of the American Valentine. She pioneered the mass production of these elaborate, beautiful cards. She used an assembly line technique employing women to handcraft these intricate designs. And that structure didn't degrade the emotion, it democratized it. Suddenly you had these tokens that were previously only available as, expensive European imports, and now they were available to the masses for as little as 5 cents. Commercialization, in that sense, just gave ordinary people access to a complex ritual.
Access, yes. But at the same time, that standardization imposed uniform norms on what is a very, very private emotion. My perspective is that the modern holiday is strategically built on market creation. It fundamentally links affection to financial pressure. The commitment you're talking about very quickly became a mandated financial benchmark, and that's where the spontaneity starts to die.
But that financial commitment it's critical to the holiday's utility. The National Retail Federation, the NRF, their data consistently projects record spending, well over $27 billion in recent years. This isn't just evidence of people begrudgingly buying a token. It shows that consumers are actively choosing to validate and reinforce their relationships through what is effectively a costly signal. And that signal is now extending beyond romantic partners to friends, to coworkers, to family. It shows as generalized cultural appetite for a day of affection, which the structure successfully accommodates.
I'm sorry. I just don't buy that the primary engine here is spontaneous love when the cost is so high. The psychology, I think, points in the opposite direction. The required gift-giving ritual is often motivated less by a purely altruistic fondness and more by a sense of indebtedness and by the desire for reciprocity.
Okay, so can you unpack that a little, this idea of indebtedness?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at behavioral psychology studies, ones that are focused on the function of these high-cost exchanges, research suggests that when people perform a costly favor, or in this case, buy an expensive gift, the motivation is uniquely associated with satisfying an existing obligation, at least when you compare it to simple gratitude or genuine fondness, when all those factors are examined together. Valentine's Day, with its rigid expectation of high financial output, it functions as a high-cost favor exchange. It's designed to secure future reciprocity and maintain relationship stability, not just to express current affection.
I see why you emphasize that psychological tension, but I would argue that tension is exactly the point. When participation is culturally mandatory and it's visible, when everyone knows the date and the expectation, the gesture is granted a unique social power precisely because of its cost.
And that is where the authenticity gets compromised. When the act is tied to fulfilling this universally recognized social script, its perceived value shifts. It goes from being a unique, heartfelt action to simply being compliance. And for the person receiving the gift, it raises that unavoidable question. Did they buy this because they love me, or because they had to?
That's a fair framing of the anxiety for sure, but let's look at it through the lens of signaling theory. For a signal of deep commitment to be credible, it just can't be cheap talk. It has to be costly or even inefficient. If I simply say, "I love you," my words are cheap. But if I spend significant time researching a perfect gift, incurring what they call search costs, or spend resources on an elaborate presentation, that inefficiency, that's the currency of its value.
But the inefficiency is so often manufactured to create that very obligation and to drive specific buying behavior. It externalizes the cost of affection. You see this most blatantly with the diamond industry. I mean, before all those strategic marketing campaigns, engagement rings rarely even featured diamonds. De Beers then strategically created the cultural standard that an engagement diamond should cost 2 months' salary.
And you see that as manipulation?
It's the intentional transformation of a decorative rock into an obligation, into a financial rite of passage. It effectively measures a suitor's suitability through an external financial benchmark. This isn't spontaneous affection looking for a way to be expressed. It's a financial gatekeeping ritual imposed by marketers, which was then accepted by the culture.
I'm not sure I'm convinced that its commercial origin automatically invalidates the signal today, though. The widespread acceptance of these requirements, that demonstrates a consensus, a desire for social visibility. The ritual provides this public, legible stage for affirmation. In the Philippines, for instance, mass wedding ceremonies are a remarkably popular activity on Valentine's Day. This highlights how the day functions as a public ritual for relationship affirmation, which goes way beyond a private, spontaneous exchange. The structure is embraced because it offers a collective, meaningful way to enact love that carries real social weight.
Yet even in those collective rituals, the pressure to conform is intense. And this structured performance becomes even more codified when you look at global examples, where the obligation is explicitly named and sequenced.
Okay, but before we dive into those formal obligations, we should probably acknowledge the flexibility that exists in the system. The holiday shows this remarkable cultural reach and adaptation. It kind of defies the idea of a single oppressive mandate. In places like Thailand, for example, Valentine's Day is widely celebrated not just by couples, but by families and friends. It's a popular day for registering marriages. It shows a genuine integration into life events. And here in the US, that same NRF data confirms the expansion to, treating yourself or organizing get-togethers with single friends. That shows a real cultural appetite for a day of generalized affection, adapted to different needs.
I see the flexibility, but that expansion often just codifies a different type of obligation. It just broadens the scope of the performance. Let's look at East Asia, specifically Japan and South Korea. They offer the clearest structural evidence for my claim. The tradition there mandates that women give men chocolate on February 14th. But that's not the end of it. It creates a formal expectation of a gift in return, on White Day, exactly 1 month later. The romantic exchange is explicitly embedded in a reciprocity loop.
Right, but that loop is highly refined. As you noted, Japan explicitly distinguishes the nature of the gift.
Exactly. They distinguish between Honmei Choco, which is true love chocolate, and Giri Choco, obligation chocolate. The Giri Choco is just a necessary social lubricant. You give it to colleagues, to bosses, to male family members where there's no romantic interest. This distinction proves that obligation is structurally built into the ritual. It's a common, necessary social expectation. The system is actually designed to handle duty right alongside desire.
I see why you'd highlight Giri Choco as proof of obligation, but I see it as proof of the structure's utility. The existence of that structure forces clarity. The person receiving the gift knows precisely what it means. The homemade choco becomes this highly legible public signal of authentic romantic love, precisely because the giver has to signal it as distinct from the social obligation. The system forces you to be clear.
The baseline is still the mandate to participate. It creates this mandatory labor, especially for women who are expected to buy or make all these gifts in February just to manage social relationships regardless of romantic interest. And then if you look at South Korea, they have Black Day in April, where single people get together to commiserate or celebrate their freedom by eating jjajangmyeon.
And that adaptation is key. The community actively creates counter rituals within the system. It affirms relationship status, whether you're coupled or single. The system adapts to non-participation instead of just oppressing it, which shows a remarkable social elasticity.
But even where the roles are reversed or adapted, that foundational mandate of reciprocity remains incredibly strong. In Taiwan, men give gifts on Valentine's Day and women reciprocate on White Day. The emotional exchange is placed firmly within this explicit model where the ultimate goal is clearly to secure future interaction and perpetuate the relationship, be it romantic or social, rather than simple, spontaneous kindness.
And this cycle of reciprocity, this necessary social structure, it brings us right back to the role of commercialization. While you frame it as peer pressure, I'd argue it's the necessary facilitator of a complex, multi-layered ritual.
A commercialization promotes so much waste, and it promotes this very narrow, standardized expression. The focus on categories like tacky candy, short-lived flowers, and greeting cards that are often thrown away. It just devalues the gesture. The high costs, like the estimated $6.5 billion on jewelry and nearly $3 billion on flowers in recent years. That represents a mandatory economic performance, not genuine appreciation for a person.
I'm not convinced that standardization automatically equals inauthenticity, though. We can go back to Esther Howland. Her commercial success, earning the equivalent of millions today by 1880, wasn't built on tacky waste. It was built on providing these elaborate artistic designs, gilded lace, hidden messages to ordinary people. She made a high-quality, complex ritual possible for a mass audience who couldn't afford to spend weeks handcrafting something. Commercialization is simply the scalable technology of ritual. It gives people the ability to participate in a meaningful way they couldn't otherwise.
It brought access, but the cost of that access was centralized power and a standardization of expectation that continues today. I mean, companies like Hallmark and American Greetings were born from this, leading to the current landscape where expression is overwhelmingly dictated by a few standardized categories chosen by marketing data. When the form of expression is dictated by external consumer categories, the individual heartfelt component of love inevitably takes a back seat. The pressure is to buy something in the right category, not necessarily the right thing for the individual.
Yet, that uniformity guarantees that the signal is understood by the entire culture. If I give you a dozen roses on February 14th, that action is universally understood as a romantic commitment signal, whether you're in Tokyo or New York. If I baked you a loaf of sourdough bread, the signal would be ambiguous. Commercialization provides the necessary shared vocabulary for affection.
But that shared vocabulary requires a payment. And that payment, that cost, is precisely what triggers the psychological mechanism of obligation. The commercial structure demands indebtedness, a necessary repayment to the system and to the partner to keep the relationship current.
And the structure demands credibility. The very thing that makes the gesture visible and understandable, that standardized cost, is what allows the commitment to be taken seriously.
Ultimately, I think the highly commercialized and ritualistic structure of Valentine's Day creates a system where performing an obligation often supersedes expressing spontaneous affection. Love may be present, sure, but the visible act of celebration is most often predicted by a sense of indebtedness to the social norm and to the partner. It confirms that the system is built on social pressure as much as it is on sentiment. The cost of participation acts as a barrier to true authenticity.
Whereas I would say the structure is precisely what allows love to be celebrated, to be quantified and transmitted across relationships and cultures. From the formal Jerry Choco distinction that clarifies social duties to the record spending on friends and coworkers in the U.S., the holiday provides a culturally legible mechanism, a costly signal that reinforces valuable relationships. This mechanism ensures that crucial feelings aren't left unsaid or unacknowledged. It transforms this diffuse emotion into concrete action.
And that is the tension, isn't it? The cost of clarity is often the loss of spontaneity. The system ensures that if you love someone, you must perform.
Indeed, and the fact that this debate, obligation versus romance, is so enduring suggests the system is successfully serving both needs at the same time. The material clearly shows that Valentine's Day persists precisely because it exists in this tension, where the deeply personal emotions of love meet the broad, structured requirements of culture. Understanding this duality and exploring the psychological and economic trade-offs involved, I think it deepens our appreciation for why this annual ritual is such a fascinating cultural system, and one we will continue to explore.